Chapter 17, Hunting 58, Hunting 59. The 1958 hunt season rolled around again, and with a good camp and transportation to it, all in our own hands, enthusiasm ran high. We had our customary meetings before the hunt, and it was decided that Dick and Gord Sellis, a trial cook for the year, would drive the empty Army truck to Lost Channel, leaving Saturday afternoon. We would meet him there Sunday morning. The fine we had paid the previous year made us decide to leave the Army truck at Jarves in mothballs until we wanted to use it again the following year after this hunt. That statement is slightly misleading. I mean to say, we would use the truck to get through the bush to the camp this year, 1958, then store it at Jarves for the following winter, summer, and spring, until we would require it again in the fall of 1959. Dick and Gord left home about noon, as planned, and had an uneventful trip as far as Parry Sound. Number 69 highway had not been yet paved north of Parry Sound, and the washboard, gravel road, gave them an awful beating in the empty truck for the next 65 miles. They had to cut their speed to about 30 miles per hour in order to keep it on the road, and it was slightly after dark when they had turned off 69 to begin the last 14 miles leading to Lost Channel. This road was even worse, because it had been built on top of an old narrow-gauge railway, and many of the ties were still sticking through the thin layer of gravel. Practically a second-gear proposition. 4 miles to Packesley railway station, and from there on it was murder. About a mile past the station there was a narrow rock cut, and on the left side of the road the bank rose almost vertically to the height of 30 feet, within 6 feet of the center of the two-wheel tracks. The headlights on the truck were not too much better than a pair of candles, so it is easy to understand why Dick did not see the large boulder that had toppled from the top of the rock and cut to rest in the left wheel track. The curve leading to the cut in a right-hand drive truck gave him no chance at all. Disaster. They slammed into that rock without even applying the brakes, and the truck flipped onto its right side, crossways of the road, completely blocking it before either of them knew what had happened. Gord's head connected with something that partially stunned him and left a deep gash that bled profusely. Dick was directly under him and felt the warm liquid falling on him, which he immediately assumed was gasoline leaking from the left tank above him. Not true, of course, but he fully expected an explosion any moment. You can easily imagine the rushed struggle to lift Gord straight up and out through the door above him to safety. The danger of an explosion lessened with every moment as Dick had shut off the ignition and light switches, and the 30-degree weather cooled everything rather quickly. They walked back a matter of a quarter mile or so to the last hunt shack they had passed to ask for help. This gang had settled in earlier in the day and were now deeply involved in a poker game that included plenty of booze. Most of them were past the stage of being interested in another person's problems, and only one of them volunteered to drive out to the highway service station for help. Dick maintained with the wrecked truck, while Gord rode out with the hunter to make arrangements for a tow truck. When the service truck arrived, there was quite a lineup of cars on both sides of the wreck, and each one in the gang had a suggestion as to the proper way to get our truck back on its wheels. Neither Dick or Gord can remember now whether police had become involved before this point or when they returned to the service station with the truck. It could have been either way because the new police station was practically next door and the OPP officers were most sympathetic to their problems. Gord received first aid as they talked about what to do next. The conversation got around to where they were intending to sleep that night, and of course there was no place available within quite a few miles. The OPP men, in an attempt to be helpful, offered the accommodation of one or more of the cells in the newly built jail in the same building. Dick was more than anxious to accept the generous offer, and Gord was still too dull-witted to offer any argument. Dick agreed that this would be the best thing to do before he heard the complete story from the policeman. It turned out that although the jail was of modern design, the facilities were somewhat limited, the same as the size of the building. The office was adjacent to the jail, and it therefore naturally followed that in order to be sure that the records and equipment remained untouched, it would be necessary to close and lock the cell door because the building was manned between 8 a.m. and midnight only. What at first appeared to be a heck of a good idea now lost a lot of its appeal, but Dick had gone too far in demonstrating his enthusiasm to go back. As the cell door clanked shut and the officer bid them a good night, Dick had a sinking feeling he would long remember. Gord was very happy to lie down and was soon asleep like a baby, while Dick paced the floor waiting for the morning to come. With nobody to talk to and a deep concern for the welfare of the truck and the hunt trip, every hour seemed like 3 before he heard the officer of the day unlocking the outer door. It was a big disappointment to learn that this was not the same officer who had bid them good night, and his frantic request to let out received a firm reply of, "Not today, you don't." Dick knew that we were due to pass this point at any moment, and the two of them must have talked a blue streak to finally convince the officer that they were not prisoners. Dick made it to the edge of the road a few minutes before we arrived, and it was quite evident to all of us that he was in an emotional state. We listened to this incredible story, and I think he was surprised that not one in the group offered a word of criticism. John and I looked the truck over and decided that we could have it on the road in about 2 hours, and Dr. Alex Barnby, a guest for that year, drove Gord to the hospital at Sudbury, about 60 miles farther north. We thought we had made ample arrangements to eliminate all problems during the several meetings held at Frank Lee's, Ellis Corman's, and our place during the fall months. For instance, Frank, John, and Ira made a trip up here to inspect the camp early in September and reported everything in good shape. John had found out that the cable had been wound the wrong way on the winch, which prevented it from working properly, and Dick had invited Gord to act as cook for the year. Nobody had anticipated anything like this. Our gang included 11 men this year: Frank, Alan, Ira, Ellis, Bing, Dick, John, and myself of the regulars, and Alex Barnby, an associate member. Gord Sellis, for whom we were happy to pay all expenses, and Charlie Bodden, who paid $20 extra to come as a guest for the year. Ira and Doc Barnby drove their cars, and I drove my truck. The garageman refused to help us do any work on his day off, but offered the use of his tools, which included an acetylene torch. The impact had driven the outside 10 inches of the front bumper into the tire and the front axle about a foot inward towards the rear of the truck. We cut that bent piece of the bumper off with the torch rather than try to straighten it, bolted the spring shackles on the frame in the same position they were welded before, and replaced the ruined tire with our spare. No hope of replacing the broken hydraulic brake line, so we drove it without brakes from then until we traded it several years later. Those who were not working on mechanical repairs helped Ira rebuild the racks as best as they could, and by the time we were ready to move out, Dick's despondent attitude had practically vanished. Gord and Doc Barnby caught up with us at Lost Channel with a good report from his examination at Sudbury's hospital, so everything was again back to normal. This was the first year the Department of Lands and Forests had ever issued license to shoot moose in our Parry Sound area, so we conservatively bought one at a cost of $15. As we were allowed to hunt collectively, it made no difference who bought it, as long as each had its own license to hunt either deer or moose. Being a registered hunt camp, we were allowed an extra license to shoot one deer to be used as camp meat. I'll never know why we spent this extra money for so many years when we had so little interest in getting that many deer, even if it were possible. About the third day, Bing shot a moose a mile south of the camp on a small chunk of land that was virtually an island because of the many beaver dams in that area. With too few men present to hang in a tree, they cleaned it and left it on the ground for a day. I can remember carefully picking each high piece of grass to put the next foot on, all the way out to the moose, and congratulating myself on a pair of dry feet. Then, as I pulled on the rope with the others, the third step put me in the water and the mud up to my knees, now as wet as anybody. It was no easy struggle to haul it to the edge of the next beaver pond and hang it in a tree. That night, camp was taken up with ways and means of getting it back to the camp, and the final decision to hire Frenchmen at the winter camp to drag it with his horse was the best we could come up with. We left camp with a full crew about noon and arrived at the beaver pond at a later hour. We were fortunate to have a coil of heavy No. 9 grape wire, which was long enough to reach across 75 yards of beaver pond and another 50 yards to the moose. Doc Barnby had the only pair of rubber waders in the group, and enough nerve to wade across without being able to see the depth of the water or the obstacles at the bottom. The waders were a pant type and came well above his waist, and at times the water came within an inch or two of going over the top. Once the wire was hooked to the moose, it was a small matter to let the horse pull on the other end. Starting at the shoreline, the driver took the horse as far as he could go in a straight line, unhooked up, and started again at the shoreline. 4 times like this brought the moose to our side of the beaver pond. We rolled the moose on a sheet of steel roofing, and then the fun began. When the horse came close enough to smell that moose, the whole cooperative attitude changed to rebellion. He snorted and shied away and refused to come close enough to be hooked up. It took about a half an hour to calm him down enough, and when the driver said, "Let's go," the horse took off almost on a run. I'll bet the driver's footsteps were 10 feet apart for the first 100 yards. There were a number of foot-deep water holes between here and the camp that were 25 yards across, and when we approached one of these, the driver stopped the horse while one of our men waded over, ahead of the horse. The driver would then tie the line somewhere on the harness and let him go it alone, because there was no way he could stay on his feet and hang on to those lines at that speed. Our man would stop the horse on the other side, and we continued towards camp. That horse was terrific. He even walked a single log, pulling the moose, across a 4 feet deep creek a few yards behind our camp. That little episode cost us $30, but nobody seemed to object to paying his share when he considered the amount of work involved. We had cut off the head and all 4 gangly legs at the knee for easier handling, so our moose was nothing to look at, but there were about 600 pounds of delicious meat to be divided among us. Add to this a few pounds of venison for each man, and the amount of pleasure we derived from a 10-day holiday, and the $40 per man seemed little enough to pay. Both Gord and Charlie fitted into our hunt gang like a hand in a glove. We soon found out that Gord was not just a cook, but a qualified chef, having served as head cook at Manning Pool during his army days and as chef for Lady Eaton after the war. We have had meals like you would never believe since the first day Gord took over, and have enjoyed his wit and humor and good fellowship. Charlie became head man of the improvement committee and never seemed to tire of fixing the camp to add to our comfort. He was also an expert marksman, having won the gold shield donated by Dominion Ammunition to those who could get a better score than 990 out of a possible 1,000. Not an easy feat. I have probably mentioned before that my luck at seeing deer during these past years had been fantastic and seems to hold out long enough to allow me to score rather consistently. Charlie required a hearing aid, which restricted his ability to determine direction of sound, and consequently eliminated those early warning noises each of us depended on in locating a running deer. In other words, he was at a distant disadvantage, especially when you consider that he had never had experience at shooting a moving target. This was also his first time to hunt in a gang or be in our northern bush, so it seemed to be everyone's pleasure to take him with them or find a favorite spot to just stand on watch. We always left it to Charlie to choose his daily hunting partner, and everyone had promises that were hard to turn down. Each night during the discussion, I had told Charlie that the others were capable of showing him the bush, but if he wanted to see deer, he would have to come with me. The week passed quickly with no luck for him, so he decided that tomorrow, Friday, would be my day. We walked the whole day and covered all my favorite areas and saw nothing, and it looked now that I was in for a good kidding after all the bragging I had done during the week. On our way towards camp, we stopped at the flume to rest and talk a little more. This spot was so named because a good quantity of water drained from a large beaver dam to run into the creek below over a 30-degree angle trough in the solid rock. With a large beaver dam on one side and the valley and creek on the other side, it formed a natural funnel which the game in the area seemed to use frequently, consequently an ideal watch. It was not long before I heard a deer coming towards us on the dead run. If I were alone, I would have been shooting from that moment. But this was Charlie's day, and it was only seconds before he located it himself, from my words of warning and pointing shotgun. He got 2 shots away while the deer was still approaching, missed it by a mile, and I thought for a second or two it would run right over us. Charlie was on my right, and the deer passed on my left within 10 feet. He was using Frank Lee's gun, a Marlin lever action equipped with a scope. For safety reasons, Charlie turned to his right instead of towards me, and in his rush and excitement, he tripped on something that would put him on his knees. To me, it had to be funny, and I suppose my laughter didn't improve Charlie's aim, because when he got the rifle to his shoulder again, he could not find the target in the scope. Of course, he is talking to me all the time, and I can assure you he didn't have too many kind words for that rifle or the scope. In desperation, he fired again while looking along the barrel, and I saw a hind leg flip out, then once more as the deer disappeared from view. I let one shot drift out in the general direction somewhere between Charlie's last two, and I found out that it is most difficult to shoot and laugh at the same time, because the only thing I hit were trees. As we were standing there cracking up over the whole thing, we heard one single shot about 300 yards away. It turned out that that stupid deer ran straight into Alan Lee, and for him, one shot is usually enough. A much happier ending than leaving a wounded deer in the bush. Everyone in camp enjoyed listening to Charlie tell his story, and as I had kept my promise to show him a deer, I stuck my neck out again and said I would give him another chance tomorrow. A lot of poo-poos from the gang, but he agreed to accept my offer, or challenge, whichever viewpoint you might take. All day long, Charlie stuck as close as my shadow, and we covered all of yesterday's routes plus an extra swig towards the south. It had been a real pleasure, but it now looked as though I had bragged once too often. We were fast approaching the creek behind our camp, and I knew at this point the day's hunt was over. Suddenly, I heard a rustle some distance directly ahead, touched Charlie's arm, and we both stood motionless in anticipation. This area was dotted with small evergreens among widely spaced very large hardwoods, and the humps and hollows plus the thousands of whip-sized trees restricted our view to about 50 yards. When the noise stopped, the head and a few inches of a deer's neck appeared between two small evergreens directly ahead, at the outside limit of our viewing area. It was looking straight at us, and perfectly still, a small but beautiful target, exactly what Charlie could handle with ease. Yesterday's episode had induced him to remove the scope that had given him such a hard time, so I anticipated no problems. As I held my gun to my shoulder, I watched Charlie out of the corner of my eye, having all the problems in the world. He did not realize that his gun, being a hammer type, was equipped with a double safety, not all bad, that required the shooter to hold the lever action pressed tightly to the stock before the gun could be fired. He aimed and pulled the trigger several times, and no bang. Time was fast running out, and we both knew our target could disappear in a split second. I aimed, fired, and the deer was gone. Charlie said, "My gosh, I thought you would never shoot." We laughed as we went towards the location of the deer, and he felt pretty silly when he realized what he had failed to do. Sure enough, my slug had found its mark in the center of that small neck, and the deer never knew what had hit it. We cleaned it, and being so close to camp, we hauled it with us. Being a small deer, it gave us no great problem. That night in camp, I was riding high, having fulfilled my promise to Charlie, but everyone else claimed it was a dirty trick to go all that trouble and then shoot the thing myself. Charlie was on my side, and the argument was a lot of fun for everyone. There is a vast difference between the number of deer sighted and the number hauled into camp, for a very simple reason. Apart from the fact that you see them for such a limited time, usually less than 10 seconds, the element of surprise and instant excitement, the biggest hazard to accurate shooting is your own position. It would seem no matter how alert or attentive you have been all day, if you take time to tie your shoe, blow your nose, walk a log, ford a creek, lay your own gun down, answer nature's call, or just plain relax, that will be the time you see a deer. Half the fun of the whole hunt trip is listening to the various stories told and the excuses each man in the group offers as a reason for missing. There are never two exactly the same, and if I told even the ones I remember, it would take another 10 pages. In spite of a very poor start, the season turned out to be one of the best. We returned home with 4 deer and our first moose and a lot of fun memories. The 1959 hunt trip seems to be a blur. There is no record in the minutes of our secrecy, Bing Harris, to indicate who was present, how many deer shot, or what happened. Everyone remembers incidents that have happened over several years of hunting, but no one can pin them down to 1959. It could easily be the year that Ellis drove partway from Lost Channel to the hunt camp. I do know that I was a passenger while Ellis was driving, and that he was getting along just great through many of the water holes that had been given us trouble over the years. We had proceeded up to this point without being stuck tight enough to require the assistance of the winch. As we climbed the large bald rock on the far side of one of the worst holes, something went bang just like a shotgun explosion right under our feet. We both thought for a second or two that someone had opened the hunting season early. The truck stopped immediately and, having no brakes, coasted backwards to the edge of the mud hole we had just left. The motor was still running, but we had no connection to the wheels, regardless of what gear he had used in the transmission. It took a very short time to find a broken universal joint had severed all connections between power and wheels. Ellis blamed himself for something that would have undoubtedly happened, regardless of who was driving, and no amount of talking could convince him he should have ever driven it again. It took a half hour or so to remove the broken part and decide to walk back out to the cars, and then go look for a replacement part at one of the wrecking yards in Sudbury. John Ellis and myself were elected for the job, while the rest of the gang carried enough supplies into the camp to last until we returned. The stalled truck was about halfway, so we each had about 2.5 miles of miserable walking. It must have been Saturday afternoon when we started to look for the wreckers' yards in a town we were totally unfamiliar with, and we made several trips across the city before we finally located the part that was needed. Not an exact duplicate, but close enough to function properly. Those guys were as independent as a pig on ice, but we were in no position to argue about price late on a Saturday afternoon, so we paid about double its value and considered ourselves lucky. As we came closer to the end of our 65-mile return trip, darkness had fallen and it seemed stupid to stumble around in the bush with little hope of repairing the truck and arriving in camp before daylight. We found a hotel located just off the Highway 69 a few miles before we reached Lost Channel Road that would rent us an overnight room. It was already bustling with early arriving hunters, and had it been one day later, we would have slept in the car. John accused Ellis of making time with the woman who showed us to our room, who seemed to respond to his courteous manner, which brought almost as big a laugh as the question, "I wonder how the gang is making out." We all knew full well they had to be uncomfortable while we enjoyed a good hotel room. It took about 2 hours to install the new universal joint, and we proceeded on to the hunt camp without further incident. We gradually gained confidence in our ability to wander in the area without becoming lost, because every day established the true location of another landmark for each of us. We still had not enough knowledge to organize an effective drive, so we used the old system of traveling in the same general direction, at least for the early part of the day. Tuesday was a cloudy day and threatened rain. We started off going due south with the intention of making a swing to the left to go east for an hour, then another turn left to go north and arrive somewhere on our Mowat Trail before the proper time to head back to camp to complete a day's hunt. In theory, this sounds great, but in practice, it turns out that the density of the bush plus the average guy's inability to maintain an accurate compass course throws the whole thing into a cocked hat. Usually, if you meet any more than 2 of the gang after the first hour, consider yourself lucky. You may be reasonably sure that everyone is within a half-mile diameter circle, but 50 yards is generally too far to make visual contact. Murray Burnham, being a strong walker, chose to take the outside or longer route, and that was his first mistake. His second mistake was a result of the overconfidence in his own ability to stay on course, and consequently not checking his compass often enough. Nobody will ever know where he actually wandered during that day, but it sounds logical that he must have crossed our Mowat Trail on one of those bald rock ridges where no evidence of the trail is apparent. This was his third and easiest mistake. When he decided the time for hunting was running out and had not found the trail, he began to take longer steps and soon worked up a real good lather. Just as the darkness closed in, he arrived at the edge of what seemed to be a river, and promptly decided he was out for the night. He fired a few shots and received answers from every direction, which was worse than none at all. Considering the possibility that it could be well into the next day before he found his way out, he kept the last 2 shells for tomorrow's food supply. Luckily, he was able to find a large fallen tree with roots extending 10 or more feet in the air at a good enough angle to afford some protection from the cold rain that was now coming down by the bucketful. With great difficulty, he managed to get a fire started and spent a sleepless night keeping it going. The rain continued off and on until wee hours of the morning, and the 2 deer he saw did not interest him at all. This was our first experience at losing a man overnight, and each man expressed his deep concern in his own way, and every deluge of rain that hit our roof brought a question from someone like, "I wonder where Murray is now." We discussed tentative plans for the morning that included notifying the police, organizing a search party to include the 75 or so hunters on the Key Valley Road, and hiring a helicopter stationed in Parry Sound. We knew Murray's health was good, except for his slightly impaired hearing, but there was always a chance of a broken leg or a gun accident that could compound the problem of locating him somewhere in the 12 square mile area. The first light of day proved that the water he had run into was the river or swamp which ran along the south side of our Key Valley Road between Highway 69 and Lost Channel. At this point, the water was almost half a mile across, too far to signal the cars he could see traveling the road, too deep to wade, and he was certainly too tired to swim. It was a real battle to walk along the bank towards Lost Channel, fighting that dense undergrowth and swampy terrain. Finally, the river narrowed and he found a partly submerged, rickety old footbridge that hunters had built in the distance past to gain access to his side. He cautiously picked his way to the other side. When Murray explained his predicament to the Nears Hunt camp, they welcomed him with open arms. If he had been the king himself, he could not have received a more royal treatment. First, a good meal, a shot of booze, and then the best bunk in the cabin. He must have been asleep before his head hit the pillow. The gang was from London, Ontario, and Murray has often mentioned the hospitality and kindness he is not likely to forget. John and I, Ellis and Dick, all walked out to our cars parked at Jarvis while one man was to remain in camp and the rest were to start their own search party. Ellis and Dick had the job of contacting all the neighboring camps and soliciting their help for an organized search. John and I were to go directly to the police station at Britt and in the hope that they might take command of the whole operation. We must have driven right past the camp where Murray slept peacefully. Of course, Ellis and Dick were on the road to greet us on our return trip, and our troubles were over. I'm not sure which was the hardest to take, the night in the bush or the nearly constant kidding the gang had given Murray from the time they realized he was all right. In any case, you may be sure we were all glad to see him back in camp, and also that he was careful to be in camp as early as anyone after each day's hunt. As I have mentioned before, there are no records to tell about the score for this year, but it is easy to remember that any of these first few years in this area provided us with plenty of excitement and game. End of chapter 17.